This meeting is being recorded.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's event with the British Association for Holocaust Studies. We're pleased today to be joined by a panel of 3 academics from across the UK, chaired by Lucinda Armstrong from the University of Oxford, to discuss religious responses to the Holocaust. Lucinda, thank you for joining us. Over to you.
Well, welcome everyone. Today we will be hearing from Professor David Tollerton, who is the Associate Professor in Jewish Studies and Holocaust Memory at Exeter University. His recent monograph, published by Routledge in 2020, was on Holocaust memory and Britain's religious secular landscape. We are also joined by Dr. Isabel Wollaston, Senior Lecturer in Jewish and Holocaust Studies at the University of Birmingham, known for her monograph, A War Against Memory, The Future of Holocaust Remembrance. And finally, we are joined by Dr. Barbara Krawkiewicz at Jagiellonian University in Krakow, who has recently published in 2021 a monograph called History, Meta-History and Evil, Jewish Theological Responses to the Holocaust. We're now going to hear from David Tollerton.
Okay. Lucinda, thank you very much for the introduction, and Barnabas, Charlie, thanks for the invitation to speak. So I'm just going to try and share my screen. Is that coming through to you? Okay, we see nods. So, so I'm just speaking for a few minutes, and given the extremely broad remit, Barbara, Isabel and I, we all agreed that we would actually just focus on something fairly specific each, just not to try and give an overview of this whole vast topic, but just to kind of give us a little bit of something just to get our teeth into and that could be useful for later discussions. So I'm aware that people may be coming at this topic from very varied directions, and so I'm pitching this quite broadly. I just thought I would talk for a few minutes about the figure of Elie Wiesel, and highlight just a few of the complications regarding him in relation to religious response to the Holocaust. So I suspect many of you are quite familiar with Wiesel, but just to introduce him, so Wiesel was a Holocaust survivor, was hugely influential in public Holocaust memory, particularly in the United States, but also globally. Here's a picture of him from 2015 being applauded in the Houses of Congress, a speech that was being given by Benjamin Netanyahu. So Wiesel was chairman of the Presidential Commission on the Holocaust, which led to the creation of United States Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington. He won a Nobel Prize for his work as an author as well. Wiesel was a prolific writer of fiction and non-fiction, which frequently contained religious themes. So he wrote about his experience of the Holocaust, or at least or directly or indirectly, sometimes in relation to Bible and biblical tradition, sometimes in relation to rabbinic tradition. He was born into a fairly traditional Orthodox Hasidic community, but at some point, as a result of the Holocaust, took on more of a stance of theological questioning. With Wiesel, things are never quite straightforward. Exactly when he began that theological questioning can be debated, and also across his different works. He's not a consistent, systematic thinker. Different works vary in their tone and their theology, as it were, although it's very unsystematically expressed. But he took on some kind of Job-like questioning at various points in his life. Despite this kind of vast body of work, he sometimes, though, in public Holocaust memory, becomes a kind of a source of like aphorisms or inspirational quotations. You can see references to Wiesel all over the place. Just to give a British example, when this is part of the original plan for the new Holocaust Memorial and Learning Centre that might be built next to the Houses of Parliament. And depending on how your screen is set up, you might be able to see that it's this very kind of blank void, essentially, this contemplative space that's this kind of culmination of the memorial journey. But there's a little passage from Wiesel on the wall. To forget the dead would be akin to killing them for a second time. And it's this sort of example of how a line from Wiesel, they pop up and they get dropped down in all sorts of places. They pop up in lots of Holocaust Memorial Day events. When I was on a plane to Krakow to go on a Lessons from Auschwitz video, we were read a section from Wiesel on the plane with the school children. Lines from him appear all over the place. And that can sometimes lead to sort of, I think, an oversimplification of it can be a challenging and complex figure. So I'll just flag up just a few of those complications. And one, I suppose, is that Wiesel became, whether he wanted to or not, a kind of leading spokesman at least in sort of religious terms or religious language, for a notion of kind of the Holocaust as a radically unique event. Auschwitz was a unique phenomenon, a unique event like the revelation at Sinai. For him, the Holocaust is not just a normal event in history, it was revelatory and radically unique, which means that he gets cited and engaged with in those ongoing and very complex debates about the uniqueness or non-uniqueness of the Holocaust and what we even mean by uniqueness. For Wiesel, coming out of that language of uniqueness is a notion that remembering the Holocaust is a sacred activity. And I think some of the kind of language of sacredness around Holocaust memory, I mean, it has a lot of sources, but sometimes you can actually trace it back to the influence of Wiesel, I think. So Wiesel is saying, Holocaust is the domain of sacred memory. And Wiesel sometimes became almost a kind of positioned himself, or to some extent got positioned as a kind of almost a gatekeeper of how we should speak about the Holocaust. Not anyone and not everyone has the right to declare, I became a Holocaust scholar or Holocaust historian or Holocaust writer. It's not given to everyone. You must be worthy of it. Unfortunately, these days, the subject is so popular, all kinds of people have entered the field and they desecrate the temple. It's this language of sacredness, language of temple. And so Wiesel was very keen to give priority to the voice of survivors, but had a more awkward, complex relationship with historians or sociologists engaging with Holocaust memory. And a couple of other complications. We're thinking about religious responses to the Holocaust, and it's worth giving some mention to Christianity here. The picture on the left here is Wiesel, a sort of statue, bust of Wiesel that was unveiled in the Washington National Cathedral last year. He appears as this figure, this inspirational figure. In all the press releases, though, they never really mentioned that Wiesel was actually very critical of Christianity in some times in his works, really challenged the idea that Christianity was to some extent culpable for the Holocaust or the backdrop of the Holocaust. And my own sense is that sometimes kind of Wiesel is the more challenging figure in relation to Christianity sometimes gets lost. And then in terms of my last complication, Wiesel was also not immune from political controversy. This is a couple of advertisements that Wiesel published in 2015, and they were quite controversial. They were published in New York Times and a group of other newspapers around the world. And he's talking about events, issues to do with Israel-Palestine. Vassell spoke out regarding many international injustices, but he was a very staunch defender of Israel. And in these advertisements, he linked biblical tradition into contemporary Middle Eastern events. He was very avowedly opposed to a nuclear deal with Iran, for instance, and tried to thread it through to this kind of reading of the Book of Esther in a newspaper in New York Times, and produced a bit of a stir as a result of it. So he's not purely this straightforward figure, but he is hugely influential. He pops up all over the place in Holocaust remembrance contexts. And sometimes the religious complications, the political complications, I think, do sometimes drop out of the conversation in a way that it would be good to engage with. Okay, that's all from me. Lucinda, I hand back to you.
Wonderful, thank you. We're now going to hear from Isabel Wollaston.
First, share my screen again. Okay, I would also like to thank Barnabas and BHS for the invitation to speak about this. I teach and research on a range of aspects of religious responses to the Holocaust, Christianization, Jewish religious responses. But what I want to talk about briefly today is a much more practical issue, which combines my areas of interest, because I'm also fascinated by Holocaust memory, Holocaust memorialization and museologization. And I also moonlight as a tour guide, and I've just come back 2 weeks ago from being the expert guide on a tour on Poland and the Holocaust. And what particularly fascinates me is how death camp sites are increasingly referred to as cemeteries, yet they're very complex if they're understood in that sense, because on the one hand, these sites are sites of mass death, they're crime scenes, they're signs of murder, there's places where bodies were disposed of rather than buried. Most of these sites initially were the site of mass graves. Those mass graves were then dug up on Himmler's orders, the bodies burnt on open pyres, and that also applies to Auschwitz. And it's only in 42, 43 you start burning the bodies at Auschwitz in particular, Birkenau. Yet this function as cemeteries causes problems, because they are not cemeteries in any normal sense. This is not sanctified ground. It's not the place of burial. It's not marked off. In a sense, you could say these sites are the epitome of unholy ground. Yet they are places where they become a focus of pilgrimage because they are the site of human remains. They are the closest approximation you have to a place of death and a place of burial. Ironically, it's Treblinka, a memorial site that was designed in the early 1960s under communism, which is the most explicit in representing itself as a site, as a cemetery. Although it was designed in the early 1960s, it's one of the few sites under communism that uses explicitly Jewish iconography. On the central memorial, which is thought to have marked the site of the gas chambers. Subsequent forensic archaeological investigations have suggested they got the location slightly wrong, but it's more or less correct. But what they do as a central part of this memorial site is you have this central memorial with its Jewish iconography, and it is surrounded by a symbolic cemetery of over 17,000 headstones. Only one of those headstones is to an individual, all the rest are either nameless or they are two communities, villages, towns, from which the population was deported and murdered at Treblinka. So here you make it very, very explicit. Yet at the same time, with absolutely no guidelines by the museum as to how people should behave at the site. It is, in a sense, is secular space. It's a tourist site, which you can choose to see as a pilgrimage site. At Auschwitz, since the collapse of communism in the early 1990s, the museum decided it would explicitly mark locations where it thought human remains were buried. This is an example of the pool of ashes, which is between crematorium 4 and crematorium 5. The Sonderkommando basically dumped human ashes in ponds such as this, or they would dump them in the Solar River, the fields surrounding the camp. But here you have an example of these memorial tablets that the museum has established to identify for visitors places which explicitly are the cemetery as they see it. They frequently describe Auschwitz as the largest cemetery in the world. They sometimes qualify that by saying it's the largest Jewish cemetery in the world. But you have these 4 memorial plaques at these locations, inscriptions in Polish, Hebrew, Yiddish, and English. What it is saying is these are places where human remains of victims are buried, and they're effectively treated as tombstones. Here you see they have the memorial candles, the outside candles, they've got stones left on top and so on. And it is giving visitors the choice to effectively act as if this is a cemetery. Belzec was designed in 2004. Prior to that, it was a very small communist memorial. Miles Lerman of the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum funded a major initiative to mark this site appropriately as he saw it. And what they did was create this massive memorial. Prior to this being built, some forensic archaeological probes were allowed, but they made the decision with this memorial to effectively cover the entire site of the camp, particularly the site of the gas chambers and mass graves, the idea being to protect it. This decision to mark it all off as sacred space, as a cemetery, is to prevent effectively any further archaeological investigation, to prevent people walking on it. What you're effectively doing is covering it with industrial slag. You are marking off liminal space. On the left, you see the entry, which roughly marks the entry of the camp. You have the quotation from Job, "O earth, cover not my blood, and let my cry never cease." A quotation that you find on a whole series of Holocaust memorials. But what this memorial is effectively doing, you have the crevice through the middle, which is marking the so-called sluice, the walk from where you would get off the train to the gas chambers. And the site on either side is marking where the mass graves were. But as I say, this is to protect the site. And a similar decision was also made at Sobibor, which is currently being redesigned in terms of a memorial complex. And again, you've made a decision there that you will wall off the area that marks the site of the mass graves, the gas chambers and crematoria. Previously, you could access those sites. But the idea now is that effectively you should close off the Himmelstrasse, the road to heaven, which was the Nazis' terminology, from the railway platform to the gas chambers. That is behind this wall, because as the designers say, you should not be able to walk on this, because effectively they are saying it is sacred space because of the presence of human remains. And they talk about this being in line with Jewish tradition about having footpaths next to cemeteries and so on. But it's very interesting, the language you have got here. This space should be sanctified and kept separate. You as a visitor should not be allowed to access it. Scientists such as forensic archaeologists should not be allowed to access it. They're given a chance prior to these memorials being built at Belzec and Sobibor, but then you stop that. And it's very interesting at Treblinka, Caroline Sturdy-Coles The forensic archaeologists got permission to do initial investigations. It's the Blink, the only forensic archaeologist to be allowed to do that at that site. She got permission from the museum, she got permission from the religious authorities, but she was only allowed to do various non-invasive procedures and some test census. As soon as she encountered sites which contained physical remains, you had to stop. And this is this whole issue of the competing agendas of these sites. As a crime scene, as a historical site, you need these investigations to know what was where. You need to identify the locations. But from a religious point of view, particularly in terms of Jewish sensitivities, you have this increasing argument that these human remains should not be disturbed, and therefore you take at very extreme positions the line at Belzec and Sobibor of literally covering it over with concrete to prevent that. And this is just to sort of suggest some of the complexities you have about these sites because of the multiplicity of ways in which people understand and interact with them. It is also why you have these constant debates at Auschwitz over dark tourism, because you simultaneously have Auschwitz as a site of mass tourism, but also as the largest cemetery in the world. And is this why, when you're critiquing behaviours at the site, you do so in the language of sacrilege? That this isn't just inappropriate behaviour, you're saying it is offensive behaviour to the dead, it is blasphemous. You up the stakes enormously. And whether those criticisms are justified of various behaviours by visitors at the site is a very interesting one. But what you're talking about is a hierarchy of visitors and assuming motivations on their part. On that cheerful note, I will hand back over.
Thank you very much, Isabel. And finally, we are going to hear from Barbara Kravkovich.
I should probably unmute myself to begin with. Okay, so thank you very much, Charlie, and then Barnabas for the invitation, and Lucinda for the introduction, and also for getting my last name pretty much just fine, which I know is, I've heard it pronounced in all kinds of different, sometimes awkward ways. So I thought I would say a few words about what kind of sort of personal, not personal story of what got me into the topic of, religious responses to the Holocaust. And specifically, I will emphasize the diversity of those responses. And to begin, I would like to quote two different sources, and I apologize for not having any slides, so I'll just read. It's the first citation comes from After Auschwitz by Richard Rubenstein, who's North American Jewish theologian, often credited with actually starting the kind of theological grappling with the immensity of the Holocaust and the possible consequences of the Holocaust for Judaism. And in 1966, Rubenstein participated in a symposium, I think it was in New York. And during this event, he said the following words. Traditional Jewish theology maintains that God is the ultimate omnipotent actor in the historical drama. It has interpreted every major catastrophe in Jewish history as God's punishment of a sinful Israel. I fail to see how this position can be maintained without regarding Hitler and the SS as instruments of God's will. To see any purpose in the death camps, the traditional believer is forced to regard the most demonic, anti-human explosion in all history as a meaningful expression of God's purposes. The idea is simply too obscene for me to accept. And these very strong words were later discussed, but kind of became the epitome really of Rubenstein's interpretation of the Holocaust and his response. And I remember I read these words, and of course I was very sort of impressed and moved by them. But then a few years later, I encountered a very different set of writings in which I read the following. The enemies that cause distress to Israel themselves do not know why God is indignant and strikes at Israel. They believe they hate Israel for this or that reason. But in truth, they are a rod of God's anger. And the Holy One, blessed be He, when He wants to punish Israel for her sins, He plants hatred in the heart of the nations of the world and orders them to oppress Israel. Like the prophet said, Assyria, rod of my anger, in whose hands as a staff is my fury, which is a quote from Prophet Isaiah. And this second citation is a fragment of a sermon delivered by an ultra-Orthodox rabbi in September of 1940. Shlomo Zalman Ehrenreich was his name. He was a very prominent Hungarian member of Hungarian ultra-Orthodoxy, and he continued to deliver sermons, weekly sermons in his synagogue. And one of the motives that kind of occurs again and again in those sermons is precisely this idea that what is happening, what we see happening, and what then starts happening in northern Transylvania itself, that it is a punishment for sin. So the very idea that for Rubinstein in '66 and later was too obscene for him to not only to accept, but even to consider. And Rubinstein was not alone in this sentiment. Other prominent so-called post-Holocaust theologians expressed this exact sentiment. We have Emil Fackenheim, another very famous Jewish theologian, saying that actually to even seek a religion explanation of the Holocaust is a blasphemy. So we have a lot of this language. And then I read those ultra-Orthodox rabbis who were writing and speaking in various synagogues as the Holocaust was unfolding. And they were using exactly that language that was so completely rejected in the post-Holocaust theology. And this was this kind of moment of, I don't know, perception of incongruity that got me involved in the research of a diversity of religious responses to the Holocaust, because I liked that you emphasized that in the title of this event. There is a great variety of these responses depending on the period and also on, to a certain degree, at least on geographical location. So it is indeed a huge subject, and what I've been doing in my research thus far was to try to flesh out and explain this disparity. You know, how is it possible that something that for one thinker was too obscene to accept was absolutely normal? There was absolutely nothing obscene about the very same formulation for a very different person speaking about the same event. So that's what I've been trying to do in my book, but I don't want to get into the details of this explanation for now, at least. So that's as a way of introduction.
Wonderful. Well, thank you everyone for three really, really interesting presentations. We're now going to sort of move into questions. And I think a good place to start, perhaps Barbara, you might like to take this one, would be why you think Orthodox and Haredi responses seem so, they're still very neglected in contemporary Holocaust research. I wonder if you have any ideas why that might be.
Yes, I mean, I don't know, of course, but I can try to make a guess. In my opinion, it has to do also actually partially with Elie Wiesel. It has to do with a certain model of theological or religious response to the Holocaust that became normative and became dominant, certainly in Northern American discourse. And this, I think, Elie Wiesel's Night became one of the examples of this sort of troubled faith. One is or was supposed to see the Holocaust as this unique event, as a sacred event, as a revelatory event, as radical evil, as something that cannot be accounted for within the limits of the discourse of traditional Jewish theodicy. And that made those ultra-Orthodox responses beyond the pale right from the start. Because it was assumed, often mistakenly, because people really came to read those ultra-Orthodox or Orthodox writings fairly late, It was and still is a fairly common assumption that they are very simplistic and that they can be actually reduced to the punishment sin framework, which is not correct. Once you start actually reading, studying Paul's writings, you can see that it is much more sophisticated. But I think that the barrier is partially moral. You know, it's people hear an explanation in terms of punishment for sin and they become outraged. And I encountered such reactions. I remember at the Holocaust Museum, I was giving a talk about Ehrenreich and about other Orthodox rabbis who used this language. And there was a guy stood up and he introduced himself as a son of Holocaust survivors. And he was really outraged. It wasn't, it was almost a kind of gut reaction on his part that one cannot speak of the Holocaust in this way. And I think that was, I mean, I don't think this is the only explanation, but I think there is something of, you know, related to that. That simply we became, the responses like Wiesel's, like Rubinstein, like Fackenheim became normative, and there was no room left, so to speak, for anything else. But it's been changing. And I think another thing that I can mention as an additional argument here is one of perhaps the only Orthodox writer who did become a little bit popular is Kalonymus Kalman Shapira, who was in the Warsaw Ghetto and he was delivering sermons. And those sermons were published for the first time, I think, in 1960 in Israel. And over time, they kind of, actually, it was Wiesel who encouraged Nehemiah Poland to write his dissertation about Kalonymus Kalman Shapira, and Nehemiah Poland wrote it. It was published, and then it kind of Shapira slowly began to be read. But Shapira is a very special case because Shapira is, I think, the only Orthodox rabbi whose writings we know from the wartime that actually says something very close to what Rubinstein and Wiesel were saying. Because there is a moment in his sermons, very late in his sermons, when he says, or at least that's how I interpret him, that, you know what, actually this covenant, something is very wrong here. It's not working the way it is supposed to be working. Something really horrible happened. And Shapira actually explicitly says that those events are unique in the history of the Jewish people. So this is something that resonated with, you know, post-war audience, but people like Ehrenreich, who was quite firm about this frame of, you know, punishment and sin, and his critique of Zionism, there wasn't an audience, I think, for this kind of thinking.
Isabel, David, do you have anything you'd like to add to that?
I mean, I think I'd just say really quickly, and I should say my internet dropped out for about a minute there, so I hope I'm not repeating anything. But I mean, I agree with everything Barbara's just said about reasons why Orthodox responses haven't been analysed as much. I think also the kind of, in the English-speaking world, the kind of works of what sometimes get labelled Holocaust theology, so like Rubinstein and Fackenheim, and then also Elie Wiesel, they are, I suppose they're kind of more translatable across to a kind of Christian theological context. So in a sense of, say, a theology religion department at a university where a lot of the focus is going to be on Christianity, that sort of discourse kind of Rubinstein, Wiesel especially, kind of can sort of be understood, I think, in some Christian contexts, even if not agreed with. Whereas when you're engaging, say, with something like you know, Orthodox debates about halakhic law in the context of the Holocaust, in the context of ghetto, like how do you practically manifest your Jewish observance and ritual, that's not so easily translatable outside of Jewish contexts. And so I think sometimes the the sort of the stuff which is more easily digestible outside of Jewish contexts has had more attention. I mean, just to give an example, teaching on Judaism in UK at A level, at the religious studies A level, you get Rubinstein and Fackenheim, these kind of figures popping up. Whereas to try and take A level students, religious studies A level students, through works which are kind of much more steeped in, say, medieval mysticism, or steeped in or debates about practice, I think is a harder job for a teacher. And so sometimes I think we have veered towards the stuff that is kind of can be sort of mapped out in a more familiar language in the English speaking world.
I would just add that I do think the situation's definitely changing. If you think of what's now available in English, which never was before, and I think that's partly confidence in the ultra-Orthodox community that it's actually now competing with Holocaust theology in certain ways by putting its material out there. You've many more memoirs published from an ultra-Orthodox perspective. But what I also find fascinating is how it's changing in museums, in Holocaust exhibitions. Yad Vashem, when it redid its Holocaust History Museum, it explicitly includes Shapira. It explicitly includes interviews with survivors talking about, say, for example, Zvi Hirsch Meisel's, and the whole idea of spiritual heroism and Kiddush Hashem is featured in the interviews there. It's working in partnership with guides and educators in the Haredi community. The USC Shoah Foundation made a point of working with Orthodox institutions to get those communities to record their video testimonies and so on. So you've now got a wealth of material. For example, in 2017, the Auschwitz Museum had a temporary exhibition in its car park, which was there for about a year, called The Lens of Faith, done in association with Daniel Liebeskind and the Brooklyn Holocaust Museum. And while that included 2 Polish Catholics and 1 Sinti and Roma, everyone else was reflecting an Orthodox perspective from the Haredi community in Brooklyn largely. And so to see that in that context is very, very interesting. But it's definitely selective. It's much more about things like spiritual heroism. I mean, that Lens of Faith exhibition, what it represents as the religious response to the Holocaust is how many great-grandchildren you've got. Because you have these panels of survivors, and for every single one of them, you list how many children, how many grandchildren, how many great-grandchildren, and it's as if reconstruction is the Orthodox religious response to the Holocaust, which is part of it. But it's interesting that the 2 Polish Catholics neither had married, or they'd married and not had children. So you had this contrast between Christians not reproducing and Jews reproducing like rabbits, which was what came across. But it was actually very interesting that that was the statement you had on every single board. It was about your commitment to life, effectively, as if that is the response. And that is a very, very interesting reading of Orthodox responses. That it's about practicalities, it's about reconstruction. And once that's done, then you can think about theory and theology, but the first thing to do is reconstruct those communities and reconstruct families, repopulate.
But if I may add something, I think it also has to do with how the Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox communities responded or thought about the Holocaust after the war. I mean, this was changing within those communities, and the change. I remember Gershom Greenberg, who is a scholar. He's at American University in DC, and he was really the one who kind of created the tiny subfield of Orthodox responses to the Holocaust, because he was the first one who started digging those things. And so he, at some point, he learned that there was this rabbi in Bratislava, that he wrote his sermons, and that those sermons were preserved. And he managed to find the son of this rabbi, of whom he heard that he had those original sermons in Yiddish. So he went to visit the guy, and was like asking, do you have the manuscript? I mean, I'm a scholar, I'm looking for the, no, why would I why would I keep it? I mean, it's been translated into Hebrew. You know, it was published. So why, you know, I mean, maybe it is somewhere in my apartment, but I have no idea. Which kind of showed the attitude. He didn't, I mean, of course, the Holocaust was important, and his father died in Auschwitz, and he himself was a survivor. But, you know, the Holocaust was not this unique, unprecedented event. It was one of the many catastrophes in Jewish history. So there was no reason really to make a big thing, so to speak, of the Holocaust. And this attitude was reinforced by the leaders. I mean, very prominent rabbis, both in Israel and in the US, Orthodox rabbis were saying basically, no, I mean, yeah, yes, we do commemorate this event together with the destruction of the first temple and the second temple. There is no need for another special day or a special museum. And this has changed. This has definitely changed in the Orthodox community itself.
Yes, I was reading something last night by Rabbi Yaakov Avigdor, and I think it was from 1950, and he was saying, oh, I don't think we should have a Holocaust Memorial Day. Maybe we should have done, but I feel like the sense of sacred memory has been lost. Again, this argument that it becomes almost sacrilegious to have a Memorial Day if it's not underpinned by a religious understanding. That in itself sort of desecrates the Kedoshim all over again. He was also one of the earliest people to talk, I mean, Esther Favsian argues actually he might be the earliest person to talk about resistance in the Holocaust, because he writes very much from the context of now being in Brooklyn and encountering American Jewry when the sentiment of like lambs to the slaughter, why didn't Jews resist? And I suppose we often now, it's quite commonplace to see religion in Holocaust scholarship framed as resistance, spiritual resistance. But what other lenses are useful for looking at religion, would you argue, in Holocaust testimony, Holocaust experience, Holocaust narrativization? Beyond resistance.
Well, I think one of the narratives you have, and it certainly emerges quite early on, is partly with the Eichmann style and so on. You have all this debate about sheep to the slaughter, and you start to contest that. But what you increasingly get is a quite vocal debate in the state of Israel and elsewhere, which is, it's almost like competitive approaches to resistance. Do you attack what you see as secular armed resistance as being un-Jewish, of actually provoking reprisals and being irresponsible? Whereas you promote spiritual heroism as concern for your community, concern for halakha, acceptance of God's will, a whole range of different things. Whereas much more recently, what you've got is an emerging Orthodox historiography saying there was an Orthodox armed resistance. So, for example, in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, you're starting to emphasize the role of revisionists, Zionists, and saying this was written out of history by secular Zionists. And you're getting these counter narratives saying, you have, for example, Menachem Zemba in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising saying this isn't a time for Kiddush Hashem, it's a time for Kiddush HaHayim, and supporting resistance and armed resistance. So it's actually interesting that even going back to sources at the time, you're now saying this is much more complicated. So there isn't an Orthodox passivity, if that's what they were accused of. You're talking about Orthodox activism in terms of rescue, and you're accusing Zionists of abandoning Orthodox communities and so on. So it's actually interesting how you have all these counter narratives emerging, and quite aggressive ones in some cases, and certainly in the 1950s in Israel, the early 1960s, you're having, it's almost like an internal debate about who's responsible. The Nazis disappear from that narrative, and that's partly to do with who was the sinners. In terms of punishment for sin narratives, is it the Zionists, or is it Zionists saying, well, history proved that we were right because we were saved? You effectively sacrificed your communities by the advice you gave in your opposition to Zionism. And you have someone like Taik Tal who almost sort of changes his mind in the light of, because if you're leading historical events, what are the lessons that history is teaching you? And you actually have that debate among certain rabbis as to, in a sense, who's proved right by how events unfolded. And so you have this huge complexity within Orthodox responses, as well as this inter-Jewish debate about responsibility. And that debate gets very, very nasty, because you're effectively blaming each other for the deaths of your communities. And as I say, you almost completely ignore the wider responsibility of the Third Reich and the Nazis. And that's a very strange phenomena.
Well, it gets nasty, like very many intra-Jewish debates about anything. They tend to get forever nasty. But yeah, it's actually ironic with Teichtal, because he became really a hero of religious Zionism because of this switch that he came to think during the destruction, that yes, actually immigration to the land is what actually God is commanding us to do, and not just those obnoxious Zionist secular leaders. But so these days he is absolutely glorified and lionized among the religious Zionists, but the Haredi, who are usually less Zionist, to put it mildly, including his own son, are trying to either kind of put Teichtal to hide him somewhere. But I did read that his son went on record saying that no, with the Zionism of my father, that's, yeah, let's not over exaggerate this thing. He did not really think that Zionism is a good response to the persecution. So yes, it is. That's why when you say like Jewish responses to the Holocaust, it should be like, I don't know for a better phrase that would emphasize how diverse and often how contradictory they are. And these days, definitely, there is a very strong emphasis on this religious heroism and spiritual steadfastness. That's what Esther Farbstein has been doing, and that's what she's writing, and she's extremely popular in both kind of mainstream Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox circles, both in Israel and in the US. And actually, this troubles me a little, because we know, I mean, we don't have a great deal of materials in terms of that would describe like daily religious life, let's say in the Warsaw Ghetto. We have some, but we don't have as much as we would want to. But from what we have, we know that things were not, again, as simple as often described in both narratives. There were religious, there were Hasidic Jews who were involved in activism and kind of social activism, helping the community, trying to save the community. But there were others who were actually rather nasty and who were mostly concerned with preserving their own sense of chosenness and specialness. So again, the image is extremely complicated, and in each of the narratives is almost trying to to simplify those things. And that's theoretically at least where we scholars should come in and help.
I think just briefly, I'd also just want to put in a word for some of the changes and challenges in relation to other branches of Judaism, say with Reform, for instance, how this is an oversimplification, but if you look at the Reform statements, Reform Jewish statements of sort of late 19th, early 20th century, sometimes they're somewhat anti-Zionist in that, why do you need a state of Israel when we need to kind of embed in our sort of these increasingly modern societies, and a lot of faith and enthusiasm for modernity, and this idea that kind of Enlightenment values to some extent are going to kind of bear great fruit, and so it's just a case of kind of updating and modernizing Judaism to fit in with the modern world. And then after the Holocaust, that it changes very significantly. And if you kind of take Reform statements from a few decades later, much more much more enthusiasm for Israel, much more tempered enthusiasm for kind of modernity, and kind of the idea or kind of rationalism, and how kind of the idea that Judaism should just be kind of made to fit in with the modern world, because I think the Holocaust kind of really dented that narrative as well, and that's a kind of it's a very sort of different set of challenges for a religious community that kind of came out of the 19th century in a very different place. And this is the thing, is that Jewish communities are so diverse going into the Holocaust, and then the Holocaust is so geographically large and sort of drawing in so many different religious groups and secular groups and Zionist groups of all sorts of different varieties, that the way in which they make sense of the Holocaust varies hugely. And then in terms of what happens in kind of post-Holocaust, there's all the different changes in terms of narratives that are more dominant in the 60s, narratives that are more dominant sort of now.
I mean, if you also take someone like Rubinstein's own biography, he's saying for the Reformed rabbinate, he's given special dispensation because of the Holocaust context. He talks about seeing the film with the liberation of Majdanek. He effectively walks away from that, switches to JTS, the conservative rabbinate. And he repeatedly says that while he finds them personally objectionable, he thinks Orthodox responses are much more credible and consistent with tradition. And it's sort of an either or he presents. But he's someone who can see someone as an individual wrestling with that trajectory of how, as he saw that reform was no longer credible for him personally. And he talks about the difficulties Abraham Joshua Heschel had at Hebrew Union College and so on. And it's interesting that Heschel almost acted as a sponsor for Rubinstein, despite how different they were. And in some ways, he was quite traditional in his practice, Rubinstein, because he thought that was more legitimate somehow, or more coherent. So he's a very, very complex figure as an individual. He's the founder of Holocaust theology in many ways, but his journey there is very complex, and his attitude to tradition is very complex.
And also the reception of his thought is fairly complex in terms of how he was, isolated at the beginning, and then when he was practically speaking living in exile in Florida because no synagogue wanted to invite him. So yeah, fascinating person, and a very good also example of how those things transform over time.
Well, I'm sorry to interrupt, but I think now might be a good time to see if anyone in the audience has any questions for you. So do please either type questions in the chat or raise your hand. I might. Oh, sorry, Charlie, were you going to say something?
I was just going to say, if no one has one, I have many. I wanted to ask something that someone mentioned earlier about Memorial Days and this idea of a specific date in which you commemorate something, and the role of religious leaders within that. So quite often you have talks from rabbis or from multi-faith groups in a view of, providing some sort of religious background to contemporary events. I was wondering if people had any views on that, on how HMD, as we kind of the market and the role of religion within that. That's not really like a question, more like a thing to throw out.
I mean, HMD. I mean, I'm really interested in the I suppose the kind of relationship with say in Britain with religious leaders, religious communities. I mean, it's absolutely true. Of course, on HMD you usually get like a joint statement from Archbishop of Canterbury, an imam who they could find who has got reasonably high status and is willing to put out a statement, and then the chief rabbi. And it's good, and they say sensible things, but I think you've got to sort of look behind it to sort of some of the messiness I think that's behind it. In terms of religious leaders and religious communities, I mean, it's worth remembering the Muslim Council of Britain boycotted Holocaust Memorial Day for a period of the 2000s, and Muslim, and that's a while ago, but I think it still points to there are still sort of messy complications regarding Muslim communities and Holocaust remembrance. I think with regard to I suppose other communities, I mean, HMD, Cara Critchell has talked about how Holocaust Memorial Day is sometimes wrapped up with language about British values, and particularly in educational contexts, and but British values sometimes gets presented by politicians as Christian values, and so part of me wants to kind of say, well, hang on, how do we put that all together? And I don't think it's always sort of quite worked through. But so I think it's nice and it's good that you get these statements, these joint statements on Holocaust Memorial Day. But I think also in other parts of the year, there's a kind of slightly messier conversation to have. I mean, and even within Jewish community, I mean, there's what have you got? You got Tisha B'Av, Yom HaShoah, and Holocaust Memorial Day. How do different bits of different Jewish communities relate to the different events? It's not all straightforward. When I went to the last time I went to a Yom HaShoah event in London, the opening speech from Henry Grudeveld, connected to the Board of Deputies, was very much sort of Holocaust Memorial Day is great. That's for everyone else. That's for everyone. Yom HaShoah is for us. This is for the Jewish community to come together. But it's actually fairly secular in its roots, and there are parts of Orthodox community who aren't necessarily that keen on Yom HaShoah and would think more in terms of Tisha B'Av and want to sort of link Holocaust remembrance in with the remembrance of all traumas through history. So that was a bit of a rambling response, but I think there's a few complications to kind of pick out beyond the kind of the nice interfaith statements that you always get.
To add to that, it was also insisting that because of the success of Holocaust Memorial Day, you have the creation of the Forum for Yom HaShoah, which was Jewish organisations in this country getting together to effectively say, what can we learn from how that's been embedded in communities and education and so on. Because it was interesting how it took decades for Yom HaShoah to kick in Jewish communities outside of Israel and even within Israel. You had Elie Wiesel as chair of the US Holocaust Memorial Council. One of his criteria was we're going to have these days of remembrance as well as the creation of what becomes the USH Holocaust Memorial Museums. You have these weeks of days of remembrance, which are deliberately tied in the US to Yom HaShoah date-wise. That's 1980 onwards, but they took a long time to kick in. But I mean, Yehuda Bauer responded to an exchange in the Jewish Chronicle about why isn't there a Holocaust Remembrance Day? And he said, there is, you're just not aware of it, it's Yom HaShoah. And that was in the 1970s, because the UK wasn't really following it, observing it at all. And that whole issue has been quite an ambivalent approach in the UK Jewish community to Yom HaShoah until relatively recently, and it that actually coincides with the growth of Holocaust memory and so on. But that assumption of we have to play a crucial role in HMD to ensure it's acknowledging the uniqueness of the Holocaust and not diluting it, but remembering the Holocaust is for Yom HaShoah. That's the sort of private, internal grief and commemoration. That's the Jewish commemoration. HMD is secular, but we have to ensure it doesn't sort of drift, as it were. And it's interesting that both chief rabbis have made a point of attending every national event, whereas you wouldn't have had Emanuel Jakobowicz doing that. You know, he was arguing against it back in the 80s and so on. But it's interesting that modern Orthodoxy and the chief rabbinate has endorsed it. And to look at their speeches each year is fascinating, because it always emphasizes this is about where was humanity, and it's about the loss of divine image and so on. There is no theology in the sense of where was God, or how could this happen. It's a very carefully curated discourse all the time. And it's about human responsibility and how that should inform you. But what they say on those events is very interesting, but that they're there to say it is also very interesting from an Orthodox point of view.
I don't really have much to say to add here, because my experiences of a Holocaust Memorial Day, I lived in the US for quite some time, so I experienced it there and in Israel. In Poland, it's a whole different story, because the day is celebrated as the anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz-Birkenau camp. That's the day. And yes, we have nice speeches and good, nice gestures. But in Poland, it is all so entangled, you know, with this kind of Christian, Polish, Jewish competition in suffering, that there isn't really a day when these two sides could come and reconcile, because it's just impossible. It's such a difficult topic. And I don't think that any sort of commemorations of the Holocaust in terms of, you know, special days or something like that, I don't think it really helps in these difficult Polish-Jewish relations.
Thank you very much. Barbara. I think on that note, we'll call it an evening there. So
maybe somebody can say something more optimistic.
I can thank everyone if that's optimistic. So yeah, thank you to Barbara, to David, to Isabel, and to Lucinda for sharing us this evening.
Thank you so much for having me.
So yeah, thank you very much, everyone. On a future note for the BHS, we're launching the program for the upcoming postgrad conference after this, so which will be at the end of May. So keep an eye and you can see who's talking on the various aspects of the Holocaust. So yes, thank you very much, everyone, and I'll leave you to your evenings. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.